Good morning, good evening, or good night. I'm not sure what time any of y'all will be watching this video. I just wanted to cover all my bases. If you clicked on this video because it sounded interesting to you, thank you so much for doing so. If this was sent to you by a friend of yours, please tell them thank you. This is a pet project I've been toying around with for the last little while and decided to finally start working on it. And my thought process for this first video here was to smoke up a chuck roast, one of the first pieces of meat I smoked personally, show you how I do it, give some backstory and some background and things I've learned, things that have worked for me, and things that I've found success in. I want to start by reiterating that just because I have found success with this method, it does not mean it's the best method. Because no matter what, whether you use my method or someone else's method, at the end of the day, you're going to end up with a delicious smoked piece of meat. Take what I have and use it, take what I have, learn from it, or take what I have and modify it to what suits you best. And again, like I said, this is a little pet project I've had in the works and just decided to finally pull the trigger. If this video goes well, I will continue to make videos and start to build a YouTube channel called Ember Alchemy. And with that, I will become the Ember Alchemist. I've got ideas of how I can expand this, but this is where I'm starting. Please, if this is interesting to you, watch till the end and leave me a comment or two. Thank you again for clicking on this video and giving me a chance to earn a subscription and a like. And if I haven't done that, please feel free to tell me how I could work to earn your subscription or your like. Thank you. And without further ado, let's get this chuck roast rolling. So right now what I'm doing here is just getting some gloves on to be able to handle meat and not have to constantly keep washing my hands in between handling the meat and going back and grabbing a pair of scissors or a knife in this case here. So right now I'm just cutting open a chuck roast that I got from Aldi. So first thing I want to do here is get it out of the packaging. As you can see, I've already put it on a wire rack on top of a cookie sheet. I just do this for my personal preference because I like to be able to separate the seasoning that I'll put on this, as well as have a spot for it to drop off, and I can then apply that seasoning back onto the meat. Because once the seasoning comes out of the bottle and comes in contact with the raw meat, I can't reuse it for anything other than that raw meat I'm using. So now that the meat's out of the packaging here, next thing I want to do here is I'm going to get some paper towels and work to pat off and dry off the meat. This here is going to help remove any excess moisture from the meat. And once I go through and do that, I will then use Montreal steak seasoning. In this case here, the Montreal steak seasoning is just your standard salt, pepper, and garlic. It is a great seasoning to use on beef. If you want to be more creative, you're more than welcome to use fresh cracked pepper, salt, as well as some garlic powder instead of using the Montreal steak seasoning. Either way, it's still going to be a great seasoning on the meat. Once I've gone through and dried off the meat thoroughly, I'll then start sprinkling on the Montreal steak seasoning, coating liberally. The chuck roast here is going to be a perfect cut of meat to do this with because the fat content of the chuck roast and the salt of the seasoning is not going to overpower the overall seasoning profile. While seasoning this, you want to make sure that you coat both sides generously, as well as you don't forget the edges. Once this has been seasoned properly, you go ahead and let it sit for a few minutes. Usually what I'll do is once this is seasoned, I will then go out to get the grill fired up and then just leave this stay on the counter. I'm able to do this because I don't have any pets at home that would be interested in the raw meat. If you have pets at home that might be interested in the raw meat, by all means move this into the fridge or make sure it's covered or tucked away where a pet can't get it. Additionally, while I'm going through this here and drying off the meat, anything that I feel is excessive on the meat, I'll cut off or is just loose and dangling. I'll cut off and remove that entirely from the meat and just throw it away. What I'm doing here is just getting the charcoal ready to go. I personally have found my best results when smoking a chuck roast or smoking in general is to use the char baskets that my Weber grill came with. Some of the people I've talked to prefer the snake method. Either way is going to result in a delicious cut of meat when smoked. And at the end of the day, you have to find what works best for you. I personally found success with the char baskets because it's going to keep the charcoals all nice and tight as they're burning and make it very easy to contain the charcoals and know when I need to add more or if I need to take some out and put into a separate grill. So what I'll do is I'll take one char basket when smoking a chuck roast, fill that up with charcoal, use the char basket as my measuring tool, and once I have the charcoal I'll use, I'll throw a few extra pieces into my chimney and then take the char basket and dump it into the chimney as well. Once I've done that, I will then take a piece of bacon grease soaked paper towel. Anytime I cook bacon at home, I will always take a paper towel, soak up all the grease, or sorry, paper towels, soak up the grease, and then throw it into a bag and use for lighting my charcoal in my chimney. You're more than welcome to use Weber starter cubes or newspaper or a paper towel with cooking oil. I've just found that with the amount of bacon I cook periodically throughout the year, I'll have more than enough bacon grease soaked paper towels to last me throughout my cooks for the year. What you'll want to do once you've got that paper towel lit or whatever you're using to light the charcoal is, if you're using the chimney, put the chimney over top of that and then just walk away from it. It'll take about 15-20 minutes to get the coals all nice and lit. You want to make sure that the coals are all the way ashed through. So you want to make sure that the coals at the bottom as well as the top, there's no more unburned charcoal left. What I mean by that is you just want to get them so that all the sides of the coal are gray and ashed over. Once this has happened, you can then pour them back into the char basket, or if you're using the snake method, you'll just pour the charcoal that you lit right at the very edge of the snake. Additionally, what I'll also do whenever I'm smoking, again, this is just personal preference, I have found great success with this. I'll take an aluminum foil pan, one of the half foil pans I get personally at Costco, and I'll fill it up with boiling water. Now, you don't have to use boiling water. I just prefer to use boiling water because it's going to help prevent a dip in temperature when the water goes in. If you use room temperature water or water straight from the tap, that water has to heat back up, which isn't a problem, which is what the idea of the water in the drip tray is meant to act as a heat sink and prevent a massive spike in temperature if you start messing with the damper on the grill or you've opened up the grill to check the meat. That water in the drip tray will help to keep the temperature at an ideal temperature without drastic swings. Additionally, once I've got the charcoal in the charcoal basket as well as that drip tray in the bottom of the in the bottom of the grill, I will then make sure that my damper is set properly. I usually like to leave a 1/4 inch or so, maybe a little less than a 1/4 inch of gap between the edge of my damper and the opening in the grill. This way it'll just allow just enough airflow to keep the coals hot, but they don't drastically swing the temperature up to 500 plus degrees. I found the best success with leaving my bottom damper open that 1/4 inch, leaving the top vent completely open. And usually what I'll do is I'll try and dial it in before the meat goes on to make sure the temperature stays consistent. Personally, I try to shoot for about 250 to 275. You can cook a chuck roast up to about 300, but 250 is going to be ideal in my experiences for properly smoking the chuck roast. For me personally, once I felt that the grill temperature has stabilized between that 250 to 275 mark, I will then start putting in wood chunks. You're more than welcome to put the wood chunks in with the char basket or right after you throw the coals into the char basket. However, I personally prefer to wait until the temperature is stabilized and put the wood on the charcoal shortly before I throw the meat on. My thought process with this is fairly simple. If you put the charcoal with the wood right away, the wood's going to start smoking, but there's no meat on the grill. As a result, you've just thrown a chunk of wood on that is now wasted. So I'd rather put the wood on right before I put the meat on, make sure I've got the proper smoke I'm looking for, and then put the meat on shortly after the first chunk of wood has gone on. The smoke that you're looking for is a very faint wisp of smoke. It's difficult to see on camera, but you want it to just barely be visible through the top vent. This here is going to be the best smoke flavor, and you know it will be the faint smoke because it won't be thick and gray. That thick and gray smoke that you see when you're lighting charcoal is a very dirty smoke that's going to make whatever you're cooking with taste very dirty. When I cooked this chuck roast, I chose to use hickory. I've used cherry, I've used apple, I've used hickory, I've even used mesquite wood. However, when I cooked this chuck roast, I had the most hickory wood, so that's what I chose to use was the hickory. No matter what wood you pick, as long as you have that faint blue smoke that you're looking for, it will turn out to be a very delicious cook. Once the chuck roast is ready to go on the grill, I will bring it out to the grill. My grill I'm using here is a Weber Performer. The Weber Performer is nice because it's got that full side table, so I'm able to set the meat down on that side table and finish prepping it. The finishing the prep work, also what I had to do was just simply stick the probe in so I can monitor the temperature while it cooks. Since this chuck roast came out of the fridge and had sat on the counter for a little bit while the coals were heating up, the chuck roast had a starting temperature of about 50 degrees. When the chuck roast went on, the grill was about 260, 270. And part of that was just tied to the grill having been left open, so the coals got a little bit hotter. Then when I closed the lid, all that heat had to slowly dissipate through the top vent. After the chuck roast has been on the grill for about 30, 45 minutes, I personally have found great success in spritzing the chuck roast while it's cooking. The spritz is going to help keep the surface moist, allowing a little bit more smoke to permeate, as well as the rub that you put on the surface of the chuck roast. I've heard stories of people using straight apple juice, apple cider, beer, apple cider vinegar. I've personally found, in my preference, my preferred option is to use a beer and some apple cider vinegar. I usually do a 1-to-1 ratio. And in this case here, I used a Sam Adams American Light, put it into a spray bottle, added the apple cider vinegar to it as well, and then just went through after that first 30 to 45 minutes, letting it bathe in the smoke without anything happening to it. Started then spritz it every 30 to 45-ish minutes. As the cook goes further, that 30 to 45 minute timeline is not as important because as the meat cooks, there's only so much smoke that it can absorb. So the further along the cook it goes, the less smoke is going to absorb. So once that first 30 to 45 minute window has passed, you want to start spritzing it. As the further it goes, you want to keep spritzing it to help keep it moist, but it's not going to absorb any more smoke flavor. So you're able to play with that time a little bit and not have to be out there every 15 to 45 minutes. If it goes up to an hour where you haven't been out there to spritz it, as long as you're past that first hour to 2 hour mark, It's not a huge issue. Just go out there, spritz a little bit extra, double check that the chuck roast, whatever end is facing the coals, has not gotten overheated. If it has, just slide it back, or you can make a foil protector like you do with a turkey for Thanksgiving to help keep it from overcooking on the surface. At this point here, the chuck roast has hit what's called a stall. The stall here is a very common thing to happen with large cuts of meat, and essentially what happens is the rate at which the chunk of meat is heating has slowed drastically. You have a few options of what you can do. You're able to just let it keep rocking and rolling through the stall unwrapped. You can wrap it, and you can wrap it with aluminum foil or butcher paper. Any which way you go is a correct answer. For me personally, I found the best success using aluminum foil to wrap up the chuck roast because you're able to put a little bit extra moisture inside the aluminum foil to help steam it. I usually will throw a little bit extra garlic in to help add extra flavor to it. For me, what I'll do is I'll take it and wrap it up, pour a little bit of the spritz on the inside, throw some garlic in on top of it, wrap it up nice and tight. Once it's wrapped up nice and tight, I then throw it back on the grill, and this is one of my favorite parts of the cooking process for a chuck roast or anything that you cook that hits a stall. Once it's wrapped, you no longer have to babysit the temperature of the grill. What I mean by that is while it's smoking, you want to maintain that 250 to 275 range. The exact temperature is a little bit debated, but the biggest thing is while it's smoking, consistent temperature. Now, once it's wrapped, it's not going to take any more smoke at all. Doesn't matter how hot the grill gets or how dirty the smoke is or how clean the smoke is. There's no extra smoke flavor that will be added to the meat once it's wrapped. So with this here, what I'll do is I'll wrap it and let the temperature climb up to 350 degrees. I do this because once it's wrapped, it's protected. It's not going to get burned as bad as if it's just sitting in there in the grill. It's not going to dry out because it's wrapped in aluminum foil, in my case, with a little bit extra moisture in it to help keep it steamed and help it break down further and a little bit faster. In this case here, I ended up running out of my heavy-duty aluminum foil, so what I did is I ended up wrapping it up 3 or 4 times with just standard aluminum foil just to help keep a very tight insulated seal around it, retain as much moisture and heat inside the meat as possible, and help push it through the stall. In addition, once it was wrapped up, since I wasn't concerned with keeping the temperature between that 250 to 275 range, I removed the char baskets, removed the drip tray to allow a little bit more room for some extra coals inside the bottom of it, as well as clean out the ash from the bottom using the ash sweep from the bottom of the grill. For this here, I just used about 3/4 of a chimney of charcoal, did the exact same thing, used a bacon grease soaked paper towel, lit that, put the chimney on top of it, and walked away while the charcoal lit. Now that the charcoal is now heated up, chuck roast is back on, wrapped up nice and tight. I've got the temperature probe monitoring the temperature of the grill, as well as one monitoring the temperature of the chuck roast. The last thing here that I need to do now is once the chuck roast had reached that 205 mark, ideally you're shooting for 205, 210. At this point here, all that intermuscular fibers and intermuscular fat has broken down. A very quick way to tell is take your instant read thermometer or thermometer, and the probe should go through the meat like a hot knife through butter. Just slide through with absolutely zero resistance. Now what I do here is you also want to let the chuck roast sit for a few minutes. Roughly 10 to 15 minutes. You can even do up to 30. All I'm doing here is I'm just taking the chuck roast out of the grill, and throwing it into a aluminum pan. This aluminum pan will then also be used to shred the chuck roast in, as well as serve it in for later. Once the chuck roast is in the aluminum pan, I then take some extra aluminum foil, wrap it up over top of it to help trap some of that heat in there as well, so the chuck roast does not cool off too fast. Now that the chuck roast has cooled off a little bit, I'm able to more easily handle it. Since the chuck roast hasn't necessarily cooled off to room temperature yet, I still want to keep my hands protected, so I throw the cotton glove liners on underneath my gloves. Once I've done that, I'll then start opening up the chuck roast, removing the foil, and removing the 3 or 4 layers of foil that I put on. The chuck roast is tender. When you grab a chunk of the meat, pulls right off the rest of the chunk of meat, and you can then just easily separate it out into the fibers with your fingers. What I'm doing here is just going through making sure that there's no giant chunks of chuck roast left, as well as any pieces of gristle that didn't render out are removed as well, just so that way what's left at the end is smoked chuck roast and not chunks of fat. If you made it this far, thank you for spending some time with me and my little adventure. If you feel I've earned your subscription and a like, please feel free to do so. If not, I hold nothing against you. This is my first time, so I'm going to try to figure out what works and what doesn't. Thank you again for spending some time with me, and I hope you have a great rest of your day, rest of your evening, or have a fantastic night, all depending on what time you watch this video at. Thank you again.